The story of John Adams begins not in the halls of power, but in the quiet, sturdy landscape of colonial New England. He was born in 1735 in the coastal town of Braintree, Massachusetts, in a saltbox house that stood firm against the Atlantic winds. This was a world defined by Puritan discipline, by the rhythm of the seasons, and by the unceasing labor required to coax sustenance from the rocky soil. The air carried the scent of salt marsh and plowed earth, and the horizon was framed by humble farms and the distant spires of meetinghouses. For a young boy, this environment was not a backdrop but a teacher, imparting lessons of hard work, moral rectitude, and a profound connection to the land that would shape his character for a lifetime. From his earliest days, young John was immersed in the practical and spiritual life of his community. His father, Deacon John Adams, was a farmer, a cordwainer, and a devout Congregationalist, a man of modest means but considerable local respect. The deacon's world was one of tangible piety, where faith was demonstrated through diligence, honesty, and service. He expected his eldest son to follow him into the family's trades, to take up the plow and the awl. Young John did so, spending long hours in the fields, feeling the ache of labor in his muscles, and learning the stubborn resilience required to prosper in that place. This physical connection to the land gave him a lifelong aversion to idleness and a deep, practical understanding of the people he would later represent. Yet, even as he worked the soil, another seed was being planted. His father, recognizing a keen and questioning mind, insisted that John receive a classical education. This led the boy to a local schoolmaster and then, at the age of 15, to Harvard College. The journey from Braintree to Cambridge was a passage between two worlds. At Harvard, he was immersed in the study of Latin and Greek, of rhetoric, philosophy, and the works of great historical thinkers like Cicero and Tacitus. In the college library, by the light of a candle, he encountered ideas about republics, virtue, and civic duty that stretched far beyond the boundaries of his colonial experience. This intellectual awakening created a quiet tension within him, a pull between the inherited life of a Braintree farmer and the beckoning world of letters and law. The landscape of his youth remained a powerful anchor, however. In later years, he would often reflect on the formative simplicity of those days. He remembered the stark beauty of the New England winters, the harsh clarity of the light, and the communal gatherings after Sunday service. He recalled the stories of his ancestors, who had crossed the ocean to build a godly community in a wilderness, and he felt the weight of that legacy. This sense of place and history instilled in him a particular brand of American identity, one that was not yet revolutionary, but was fiercely independent, self-reliant, and deeply suspicious of unchecked authority, whether it came from a distant king or a local mob. His mother, Susanna Boylston Adams, provided a counterbalance to his father's solemn piety. She was known for her fiery temperament and strong opinions, a woman of passion and conviction. From her, John may have inherited the forthrightness and the occasional volcanic temper that would both aid and hinder him in public life. The household, therefore, was a crucible of contrasting influences: his father's steady, virtuous diligence and his mother's more volatile strength. It was a childhood that taught him the value of both principle and passion, lessons he would carry into the fiery debates of the coming revolution. As he grew into a young man, the wider world began to press upon the quiet precincts of Braintree. News of colonial disputes over taxes and trade would arrive with the postwriter, discussed in low tones at the tavern or after church. The concepts of liberty and representation he studied in his books began to have a tangible, urgent meaning. The soil he tilled was not just familial property, it was, he came to understand, a stake in a larger political compact. His boyhood, which seemed so bounded by local concerns, was in fact the perfect preparation for a national destiny, grounding a towering intellect in the unshakable realities of hard work, community, and the quiet dignity of a freehold. After his graduation from Harvard in 1755, John Adams faced a common dilemma for a scholarly young man of his station: what path to follow. He briefly took a position as a schoolmaster in Worcester, an experience he found confining and frustrating, a mere diversion from a future he could not yet see. It was during this period of uncertainty that he began to read the law, first tentatively, then with a growing and all-consuming fascination. The law, to his mind, was not a dry collection of statutes, but the architecture of an orderly society, the framework upon which justice, liberty, and human relations could be balanced. He decided to pursue it in earnest, and this decision led him to Boston, the bustling, opinionated heart of Massachusetts. In 1758, he entered into a formal apprenticeship with James Putnam, a prominent barrister in Worcester, and after 2 years of intense study, he was admitted to the bar. He soon moved his practice to Boston, a city alive with political tension and commercial energy. Here, he established himself not in grand courtrooms, but in the quiet of his study. His true preparation occurred in the long, solitary hours spent by lamplight, surrounded by ponderous legal texts like Coke's Institutes and the volumes of English common law. He filled his diaries with intricate notes, not just on legal precedent, but on the philosophical underpinnings of governance and human nature. This was a time of inward cultivation, of building the intellectual foundation that would later support the weight of a nation's founding. His legal practice grew slowly, built on a reputation for meticulous preparation and formidable, if sometimes ponderous, argumentation. He took on the small, unglamorous cases that formed the bulk of a colonial lawyer's work, disputes over property boundaries, debts, contracts, and inheritance. In arguing these cases, he gained an intimate understanding of the lives, concerns, and grievances of ordinary people, merchants, farmers, tradesmen. He saw how British imperial policies, like the Sugar Act and the Stamp Act, reached down from London to disrupt these local affairs, to impose burdens and deny rights. The abstract principles of liberty he read about in his books were suddenly made concrete in the frustrations of his clients. One of his most significant early cases, however, thrust him into the heart of the gathering political storm. In 1769, he made the controversial and principled decision to defend the British soldiers accused in the Boston Massacre. To a population seething with anger, this seemed an act of treason to the colonial cause. But for Adams, it was a non-negotiable commitment to the rule of law. He believed that even the most despised defendants deserved a fair trial, and that for the law to mean anything, it must be applied evenly, without passion or prejudice. His successful defense, which resulted in acquittals for most of the soldiers, was deeply unpopular but proved his unshakable integrity. It demonstrated that his commitment to justice transcended immediate political passions, a quality that would define his often uncompromising career. Life in Boston was not all study and solemn duty. He courted and, in 1764, married Abigail Smith, a partnership that would become his greatest source of strength and intellectual companionship. Their early married life in a small house on Brattle Square was filled with books, conversation, and the beginnings of a family. Abigail's keen mind and revolutionary fervor complemented his more measured, legalistic approach. Together, they discussed the great issues of the day, forming a private salon where the ideas of the American Revolution were nurtured. His quiet pursuits in Boston, therefore, were balanced by this vibrant domestic partnership, which anchored him emotionally even as his public responsibilities grew. As the 1760s turned into the 1770s, the quiet study of law became inseparable from the loud cry for rights. Adams began to write anonymously for the newspapers, crafting essays that used legal and historical arguments to dissect and denounce British overreach. His dissertation on the canon and feudal law argued that the American struggle was a continuation of the timeless fight against tyranny. His study was no longer just a place for private contemplation, it had become a workshop for revolution. The skills he honed there, precise argument, deep historical reference, and a profound belief in process, would be the very tools he would bring to Philadelphia. The lawyer who had mastered the intricacies of a property deed was now preparing to help draft the deed to a nation. When John Adams arrived in Philadelphia in the summer of 1774 for the First Continental Congress, he was a respected Massachusetts lawyer, but largely unknown on the national stage. The city was a revelation, larger, more cosmopolitan, and more divided than Boston. The delegates, gathered from 12 colonies, were a collection of wary strangers, united by common grievance, but separated by deep regional differences, economic interests, and personal temperament. Meetings were held in the imposing Pennsylvania State House, its chamber often stuffy and tense. For Adams, a man of intense focus and sometimes overwhelming verbosity, this was a new and challenging theater, one that required patience, diplomacy, and a careful modulation of his natural fervor. He initially observed, taking the measure of the assembly. He saw the cautious conservatism of men like John Dickinson of Pennsylvania, who pleaded for reconciliation, and the fiery radicalism of his cousin, Samuel Adams. Adams positioned himself as a crucial bridge between these factions. He was, as he later described himself, obnoxious, suspected, and unpopular for his unambiguous stance on independence, yet he was also a proceduralist, a man who believed in the sanctity of debate and the necessity of formal resolution. His power grew not from oratory on the floor, though he spoke often and at great length, but from his indefatigable work in committees, where the real details of governance and resistance were hammered out. In these committee rooms, often meeting late into the humid Philadelphia nights, Adams's legal mind found its highest purpose. He helped draft the Declaration of Rights and Grievances, carefully enumerating the colonists' entitlements as English subjects. He served on dozens of committees, dealing with everything from securing gunpowder to designing a continental currency. He was, as Thomas Jefferson later said, the colossus of independence, the pillar of the pro-independence cause. His most enduring committee work, however, was his advocacy for the creation of a continental navy. He saw beyond the landlocked thinking of many delegates, understanding that sovereignty required control of the seas, an argument that revealed his strategic foresight. The pinnacle of this deliberative process came in the fateful summer of 1776. As the military conflict intensified, the Congress inched toward a final break. Adams was the floor manager for independence, tirelessly persuading, cajoling, and arguing with reluctant delegates. When Richard Henry Lee of Virginia presented the resolution for independence, it was Adams who rose to defend it in a speech that witnesses described as transcendent, a blend of logic, prophecy, and passion. He did not write the lyrical words of the Declaration of Rights that followed. That task fell to Jefferson, but he was its foremost champion, its indefatigable engineer in debate. His victory in that boat was the culmination of 2 years of relentless, meticulous political labor. Life in Congress was also a personal trial. He was separated from Abigail and his children for months on end, a separation that caused him profound loneliness and anxiety, as revealed in their poignant correspondence. He lodged in boarding houses, suffered from ill health, and fretted over the war's progress and the precariousness of their cause. The weight of responsibility was immense. He knew that their deliberations could lead to triumph or to the scaffold for treason. Yet, in this pressure cooker of history, he formed enduring bonds and bitter rivalries. His partnership with Benjamin Franklin was pragmatic but often strained. His early admiration for George Washington solidified into unwavering support, and his complex, lifelong friendship and feud with Thomas Jefferson began in these chambers. The Continental Congress was John Adams's true political education. It transformed him from a provincial lawyer into a statesman of continental perspective. He learned the art of coalition building, the frustration of compromise, and the glacial pace of collective action. He saw the birth of a nation not in a single dramatic moment, but in 1,000 small votes, committee reports, and procedural maneuvers. The quiet deliberation in Philadelphia was, for him, the essential, unglamorous work of freedom. It was here that he confirmed his core belief, that stable governments are not born from chaos or sheer will, but from reasoned debate, established process, and a stubborn fidelity to law, even in the midst of revolution. In the spring of 1778, With the Revolutionary War locked in a desperate stalemate, John Adams received a summons that would pull him from his familiar world. Congress appointed him a commissioner to France, tasked with securing the vital alliance that Benjamin Franklin had already begun to cultivate. For a man who had never ventured beyond the American colonies, the journey itself was a monumental undertaking. He boarded the frigate Boston with his 10-year-old son, John Quincy, embarking on a perilous winter crossing. The voyage was a harrowing trial of storms, the constant threat of British patrols, and even a fleeting, violent engagement with an enemy vessel. For weeks, Adams was confined to a tiny, rolling cabin, utterly out of his element, his destiny entrusted to the sea and the skill of his captain. He arrived in Paris to find himself an outsider in a glittering, complex, and often baffling world. His colleague, Benjamin Franklin, was already a sensation, adored by the French court and public for his rustic wisdom and sophisticated wit. Adams, by contrast, was stiff, formal, and blunt, qualities that did not endear him to the delicate etiquette of Versailles. He was deeply suspicious of the French aristocracy's extravagance, viewing it as a moral corruption in stark contrast to American simplicity. His mission was to work with Franklin and Arthur Lee to manage the alliance, secure loans, and acquire supplies, but he often chafed at what he saw as Franklin's overly accommodating and informal style. Adams believed in direct, vigorous diplomacy, and he spent long, frustrating hours drafting precise memorials to French officials, arguing for more substantial naval support. This first diplomatic posting was a lesson in humility and nuance. He came to understand that international relations were not governed by the clear principles of Puritan ethics or common law, but by the shifting sands of raison d'etre, the interests of the state. He learned French painstakingly, studied European history and politics voraciously, and sent detailed analyses of the European balance of power back to Congress. Despite the social discomfort, his diligence was invaluable. He helped negotiate the crucial loans that kept the American war effort solvent, and he laid the groundwork for the later Peace Commission. His son, John Quincy, served as his secretary and companion, receiving a world-class education in diplomacy by his father's side, an experience that would shape the boy's own destiny. His return to America was brief, for in 1779 he was sent back to Europe, this time with the monumental task of negotiating peace with Great Britain when the time came. The ensuing years were a diplomatic odyssey. He was in the Netherlands, where through sheer tenacity and financial acumen, he secured formal Dutch recognition and critical loans, a triumph he considered one of his greatest achievements. He shuttled between Paris, Amsterdam, and later London as one of the peace commissioners. The negotiations in Paris that culminated in the Treaty of 1783 were a masterclass in patience and persistence. Adams, alongside Franklin, John Jay, and Henry Laurens, insisted on American independence as a precondition for talks, and he fought doggedly for favorable terms on fishing rights and borders, protecting New England's interests with a lawyer's precision. After peace was won, he remained in Europe as the first American minister to the court of St. James's. His audience with King George III in 1785 was a moment of profound historical irony and personal vindication. The man who had been a chief architect of revolution stood before the monarch whose authority he had helped dismantle. The meeting was stiff but courteous, a symbolic closing of one chapter. His time in London, however, was frustrating. The British were cool and unreceptive to meaningful commercial agreements. Yet, these years abroad were intellectually fertile. He observed the European systems of government, confirming his growing fears about the instability of pure democracy and the dangers of aristocratic decay, ideas he would later pour into his seminal work, A Defense of the Constitutions of Government of the United States of America. These Atlantic sojourns, spanning nearly a decade, fundamentally changed John Adams. They broadened his perspective from that of an American patriot to that of a global statesman. They exposed him to the realities of power politics and convinced him of the unique, fragile experiment that America represented. But they also came at a great personal cost. Years of separation from Abigail and his homeland, chronic loneliness, and bouts of self-doubt. He returned to America in 1788 not as the fiery advocate of 1776, but as a wiser, more seasoned, and somewhat weary figure, bearing the deep impressions of a world he had helped his nation join, yet from which he felt eternally distinct. John Adams assumed the presidency in March 1797, inheriting a nation deeply fractured. He followed the iconic George Washington, a near-impossible act, and faced a rising tide of partisan fury between Alexander Hamilton's Federalists and Thomas Jefferson's Democratic Republicans. His inauguration was not met with universal acclaim, but with the simmering tensions of a young republic testing its limits. The Executive Mansion in Philadelphia, and later the unfinished President's House in Washington, D.C., were not centers of opulent court life, but often lonely command posts. Here, Adams bore the unique, isolating burden of the office, a weight felt most acutely not in public ceremony, but in the quiet hours of solitary decision-making. His presidency was immediately dominated by a crisis not of his making, the quasi-war with France. The French Directory, angered by American neutrality, had seized American ships and insulted American diplomats. War fever gripped the nation, and many in his own Federalist Party, led by Hamilton, clamored for a full-scale conflict. Adams, however, was guided by a core principle. He would not let the young nation be dragged into the endless European maelstrom. In the stillness of his study, he resisted the bellicose pressure. He made the unpopular but courageous decision to pursue a dual path. He bolstered the Navy to defend American honor, yet he quietly dispatched a new peace commission to Paris. This was executive leadership at its most trying, acting against the passions of the public and the schemes of his own cabinet. The political fallout from this crisis led to his gravest mistake, signing the Alien and Sedition Acts into law in 1798. Fearful of foreign subversion and stung by vicious attacks in the Republican press, Adams acquiesced to these measures, which allowed for the deportation of non-citizens and criminalized criticism of the government. In his quieter moments, he likely saw the danger. His legal mind knew they tested the First Amendment. Yet, swept up in the atmosphere of fear and urged on by Federalist hardliners, he allowed them to pass. The acts became a lasting stain on his record, a testament to how the burdens of office could lead even a principled man to compromise the very liberties he had helped establish. His domestic life in the Executive Mansion, shared with the ever-present Abigail whenever her health permitted, was a small sanctuary. She was his chief advisor and confidant, her letters filled with sharp political insight and steadfast support. They would walk the grounds together, discussing affairs of state as they had in their youth. Adams maintained the simple habits of a New England farmer, rising early and retiring to his books. He found solace in his correspondence with old friends and in the company of his cabinet, though he grew increasingly distrustful of several, particularly Secretary of State Timothy Pickering and Secretary of War James McHenry, whom he correctly suspected of being more loyal to Hamilton than to himself. The defining triumph of his presidency came not with fanfare, but as a quiet diplomatic breakthrough. While the public and his party still raged against France, his peace envoys, navigating the new political landscape after Napoleon's coup, succeeded. The Convention of 1800 peacefully dissolved the Franco-American alliance and ended the Quasi-War. Adams considered this his greatest service to his country, averting a costly, divisive war and securing peace with honor. He famously later wrote, "I desire no other inscription over my gravestone than, 'Here lies John Adams, who took upon himself the responsibility of the peace with France in the year 1800. It was a victory of sober judgment over martial impulse, achieved against overwhelming political headwinds." His final year in office was shadowed by the knowledge that he would likely not be re-elected. The Alien and Sedition Acts had galvanized the opposition, and Jefferson's Republicans mounted a powerful campaign. In his lame duck period, facing defeat, he made one last series of consequential decisions. He resisted calls to launch further military adventures and, most importantly, He filled numerous judicial vacancies with Federalist judges, including the appointment of John Marshall as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. This Midnight Judges Act was criticized as partisan, but it secured a Federalist legacy in the judiciary. On the eve of Jefferson's inauguration, he rose before dawn and departed Washington, refusing to attend his successor's ceremony. It was a somber, proud, and lonely exit, the final quiet hour of a presidency defined by burdens shouldered, a war avoided, and a union preserved, albeit at great personal and political cost. The long road home ended at Peacefield, the farm in Quincy, Massachusetts, that John and Abigail had purchased years before. After his defeat in the election of 1800 and his poignant departure from Washington, Adams returned, in his words, to the rock upon which I was first formed. The sprawling, comfortable house, surrounded by orchards, gardens, and fields, was his sanctuary and his anchor. Here, in the long twilight of his life, he exchanged the burdens of statecraft for the rhythms of the seasons, though his formidable mind refused to settle into mere pastoral repose. The quiet of the countryside was filled not with idleness, but with reflection, correspondence, and the deep satisfactions of family. His days took on a gentle, predictable pattern. He rose with the sun, a habit unbroken from childhood, and would often walk the property, inspecting the crops, the orchard trees he had planted, and the stone walls that bounded his land. Physical labor, once a necessity, was now a therapeutic ritual, a reconnection with the soil of Braintree that had first shaped him. After breakfast, he would retire to his book-lined study, a room crowded with the history of his own century. He read voraciously classics, theology, history, and the latest political tracts, remaining a keen, if often cantankerous, observer of the world he had helped create. The act of reading was a dialogue, and the margins of his books filled with his forceful, sometimes argumentative, annotations. The greatest joy and occupation of these years was his correspondence. Letters flowed to and from Peacefield, connecting him to the nation's intellectual life. He reconciled with Thomas Jefferson in 1812, thanks to the benevolent mediation of their mutual friend, Dr. Benjamin Rush. The ensuing exchange of letters, spanning 14 years, is one of the most profound treasures of American literature. In these pages, the two aging patriarchs debated everything: philosophy, religion, the French Revolution, the nature of aristocracy and democracy, and the meaning of their own legacy. It was a conversation that helped heal a personal rift and, more importantly, helped define the ongoing American experiment. Through his pen, Adams remained an active force, clarifying his political philosophy for posterity. Family was the warm center of his world. He delighted in the company of his children and, especially, his grandchildren. His son, John Quincy Adams, was following a brilliant political career of his own, a source of immense pride and anxiety for the old president. When John Quincy was elected president in 1824, John Adams felt a profound sense of dynastic fulfillment, a rare occurrence in Republican history. Abigail's death in 1818 was a devastating blow, leaving him truly lonely for the first time. She had been his partner for life, and her absence cast a long shadow over Peacefield. Yet he carried on, sustained by the memory of her strength and by the frequent visits of his extended family. As the decades passed, he became a living monument, a tangible link to the founding era. Visitors made pilgrimages to Quincy to pay their respects to the last surviving signer of the Declaration of Independence, who had also been president. He would receive them with a mix of old-fashioned courtesy and blunt opinion, his mind sharp even as his body grew frail. The 50th anniversary of the Declaration's adoption, July 4, 1826, approached with a sense of poetic national significance. That day, as bells rang across the country, the 90-year-old Adams lay dying at Peacefield. His last words, reportedly, were "Thomas Jefferson survives," unaware that his friend and rival had died just hours earlier in Virginia. His own passing on that sacred anniversary seemed a final, fitting act of historical symmetry. Peacefield was not just a place of retirement, it was the final chapter in a long argument about republicanism and human nature. In its quiet rooms, Adams wrestled with his legacy, defended his decisions, and observed with a mix of pride and concern the nation he had midwifed. The farm represented the culmination of his journey, from the rocky fields of his boyhood, through the global stages of power and diplomacy, back to the enduring simplicity of home. His long twilight was a time of integration, where the statesman, the philosopher, and the farmer finally became one. The silence of Peacefield was filled with the echoes of a tumultuous age, now softened by time, distance, and the deep, abiding peace of a life fully, fiercely, and faithfully lived.